This is a panel session on the global economy and on international development. We are very happy to have with us this morning three very distinguished speakers. Mansour Dailami is with the World Bank, where he is manager of the Emerging Global Trends team of the Development Prospects Group at the World Bank. Our second speaker, James Manyika, is a director of the McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey & Company's economics research arm, and a director, senior partner of McKinsey in the San Francisco office. Our final speaker will be Matthew Bishop. Mr. Bishop is the U.S. business editor and New York bureau chief of The Economist. His new book, The Road from Ruin, How to Renew Capitalism and Put America Back on Top with Michael Green, was just published this month. Following our speaker presentations, there will be time for your questions. Please, again, pass your questions cards up to council staff during the presentations, and I will do my very best to introduce them to our panelists. We will turn immediately to Mansour Dailami. Thank you, Mansour.
Well, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that's great pleasure and privilege for me to participate in this distinguished panel and share with you my thoughts about the development prospects that we see in the next decade or so. Coming after the Undersecretary formats makes my job very easy because he provided an excellent overview of global economy, and I would focus much more on the challenges for developing countries. But I cannot resist being in San Francisco not to refer to the United Nations Conference for International Organizations that was held in this city on April 25th, 1945. And that obviously provided the foundation for peace and security. But much of obviously discussions on economic and financial issues, trade issues, were being held in the East Coast of the United States, in Washington, and later on in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, which the so-called the Bretton Woods system that the Undersecretary referred to was reconstructed. But one point which I think we might have to make particularly at this juncture of history is that the reason, when as a historian we go back to those days, the discussion which took place, the initiative that was put forward, the main factor for success was the leadership, political imagination, vision, and commitment to multilateralism that the United States brought to bear in the reconstruction of the world order, and reconstructed what we call a liberal, open international economic system. And in fact, there was that system that benefited many of developing countries that today have become part of the system and to some extent become challengers of the system. If you look, let's go by 1961, that the rich countries established the OECD as the club, and then you had the Second World, which was mostly centrally planned economies, and then you had the Third World. The French economist Alfred Sauvé in 1952 referred as the Third World. We weekly refer to developing countries. But 1961, already, Japan had been growing at close to 9% from 1947 to 1961. Western Europe, which had been integrated in the United States economy and was growing as close to 5.6%, the United States grew to 3.3%. We already had, by 1961, membership in the United Nations increasing from 51 so-called founding countries to 104. We had the trade organization under the GATT, which later became WTO, and we had the international monetary system operating under Bretton Woods, at that time fixed exchange rates, and obviously went through significant changes later on. But the point is, 1961, the world was divided into three blocks, and developing countries, by and large, operated at the periphery of the system. They were not as part of decision makers. But now, fast forward to 2010. This is the second decade of the 21st century unfolding. We are just emerging from the worst financial crisis of the past 60 years. We are just leaving behind the so-called Great Recession, and thanks God it didn't become a Great Depression. I remember quite very well, particularly during the fourth quarter 2008 to first quarter 2009, that the economies across the world were falling. Industrial production, manufacturing sector, falling in order of 20, 30%. Markets, financial markets, again, across the world, they were trading on panic, not the fundamentals. Stock markets declining 2, 3% per day. Risk premium in developing countries, bond issues going up when it was 150 to 200 basis points, which means that's 2% higher than the US 10-year Treasury bills, to 900, 950 basis points. What really was happening, the consumer investor confidence had been shaken, had been in fact shattered. We saw the worst part of globalization during that 6 months. But at the same time, we saw the best that the international system could offer, could deliver. We saw central banks joining hands in a kind of collective way, providing the necessary liquidity that the markets needed. When they realized that the monetary policy by itself cannot do the job, governments put together quite significant fiscal stimulus, United States, China, many countries, to pull the world economy out of the recession. We saw significant cooperation and coordination across the major central banks through various mechanisms that they had put together. And that is how we saw the confidence started changing. Because markets, what they need when there is a period of panic, more than anything else, they want to know there is somebody in charge. They want to know there is somebody who, number one, recognizes the problem, and I think that was made very clear, particularly in October 10, 1998, with the major central banks simultaneously reduced interest rate. When they came, they acknowledged that we realize there's a serious problem, but we are ready to provide solution as much as it takes. And that really was the beginning how we saw the sentiment change from all of this, I would say, in fact, March 9, 2009. As part of my job, I was monitoring markets virtually every day, waking up like 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, looking at them, preparing a short note. I could see that, how markets changed quite clearly. And since then, we have seen significant normalization of financial markets. Risk premiums have come down. Liquidity in international market to a large extent have been restored. And we saw increasing sign of a kind of important recovery taking place. But this recovery, by and large, is very fragile still. Why? Because we are facing significant unemployment. United States close to 10%. Again, in many other countries, in Europe, even China. And that is going to be a major challenge to many governments to provide leadership and to provide a growth. I mean, there was discussion of sustainable growth that today people are talking about. During the 2007, 2009, we had growth, we had boom. But that growth was very much based on asset bubbles. If you look at, for instance, the stock market in the United States or the wealth, it increased from 41 trillion in the second quarter 2002 to 65 trillion by 2007. But the real disposable income increased by only 2.6%. It was easy to have growth when people felt kind of they were rich. But that obviously is not going to be sustainable, because when markets, born based on speculation, based on something what called the asset bubble, it burst. And looking forward, there are three challenges that I think we need to face. Number one, as I said, for the industrial countries, putting growth on the right footing means manufacturing, means production. not just pure speculation. Secondly, when we look at the developing world, we see that actually the rate of growth that they have been experiencing, recording, 2002 to 2007, they grew 3 times higher than the industrial countries. When we look forward, we see that is beyond the cyclical growth. There are fundamental reasons why developing countries are going to grow at a higher rate. Number one, obviously, is demographic factor. Second is the potential for growth. There's a need for more. In a sector like infrastructure, education, health, there's significant need that they need to provide through growth. When we look at this then scenario, what we see, we call a multipolar world system emerging. That you're going to have a multiplicity of growth centers. Definitely, the United States will continue to be a very important, leading in terms of size and power. Europe, EU, maybe Eurozone countries, they will be the second pole. And there's some discussion. The third pole could be China by itself, could be China with some Asian countries. It could be BRICS countries, China, Brazil, India, and Russia, in some combination. But there is no doubt that we are going to see a multiplicity of growth, multiplicity of economic and financial power, and therefore the key challenge is how to manage this multipolar world that we are looking forward. And the key question here is that when you have a system that has changed so much from the past, inevitably it's going to create some shocks. But again, going back to history, this is not the first time that we have seen some kind of what you call epoch-making shocks in the system. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, 1990s, the fact that, as the Secretary mentioned, the reintegration of China and India coming to the international markets. If you just look at the size of the labor force, China and Eastern European countries, when they free basically joined the markets, 850 million more people joined the labor force in the free market economy. That's close to 35% of the world labor force. The implication of that obviously has been partly that the wages, particularly for the lowest grade, is being affected across the world. Secondly, we have seen a much lower inflation. We don't see the inflation of, let's say, 20, 30% that we had in the 70s, 80s. Nowadays, when we talk about the inflation going up, we're talking about maybe going up from 2% to 2.5%, maybe 3%. But fundamentally, because of this reintegration of China, because of the huge amount of expansion in the size of the labor force, we are looking at a period that inflation is going to be much more moderate than we have seen in the past. But it's very interesting that the world economy coped with that, dealt with that. In terms of integration of Eastern Europe, was done through creation of, let's say, EBRD. Much of the European countries now today being integrated with the Western European countries. The World Bank, the IMF, they provide a significant amount of loan to Eastern European countries. Our loans to Eastern European countries increased from $1.5 billion in the 1980s. 2009, it was $9 billion, and this year is going to be $10 billion, almost 30% of the bank. Then there were international institutional framework to absorb those shocks. Now, looking into the future, what are the key challenges that we may face? Number one, I would say there's a China, which is by class of its own. Apart from the size, apart from the rapid growth, China today has established a very close common interest in the United States. There's a mutuality interest. United States is the largest destination for China's export, and China is the largest investor in United States government debt. Latest is about $890 billion. There is a commonality interest there. And I think this commonality interest is very useful, at least for the medium term, that we need to make sure that we can get out of this recovery. Then you have obviously other countries like Brazil, India, Russia, maybe Indonesia, that they're coming up, they want to be part of the system. Now, the G20, that the Undersecretary mentioned as now being replacing at G7 as the key forum for international cooperation is a very positive step compared to G7. But the part of the problem with G20 that, number one, is exclude many countries. It's not an inclusive, it's not a universal representation of all the countries. And on the other hand, it's large. The decision-making become more complicated. When you have big problem, virtual cooperation issues, it's easier to have a smaller group than a larger group, obviously. And what is really the big issue here is that many of these smaller countries that today been excluded, they are the ones that have been affected very much by this crisis. I wanted to refer to one statement from President Truman's address to the opening session of the UN conference in 1945. Here's a very line which I thought it really echoes even today. He said, "We must build a new world, a far better world, one in which the eternal dignity of man is respected." That was mentioned almost 6 years ago, but it applies even today. It applies because when we look around the world, we see 1.2 billion people that live under extreme poverty. That was defined living under $1.25 per day. The crisis itself added 64 million to that. We see almost 50% of people in Africa don't have access to safe water. 70% don't have access to electricity. We see that if you look at the poverty defined by $2, there is 79 million more people added. The problem with this type of crisis for lower, poor countries is that because much of the population cross the economic poverty line, even small changes is affecting quite a lot. Governments in this situation, they cut back on education, on health, on nutrition. And this could have a longer-term impact. When children are not properly nutrition, these have impact on their education attainment. We have seen crisis after crisis that monitor that generally families to save income, they don't send children to school if they have to pay for it. And often it's the girls that become much more victimized. Not because the girls are not as smart as the boys, but there's a general prejudice against the girls, and the boys, they're let to go to a school, but it's the girls did not get. We see that crisis after the crisis. And that's why that this crisis, although we are recovering, and we are getting out of it, but the consequences that, in the social aspects of it, is going to be with us for some years to go. And I'd like to go back to this line, that the eternal dignity of man cannot be respected until we address those poverty problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is James Manyika from McKinsey Global Institute.
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's a real privilege to be in front of all of you and to be part of this very distinguished panel. Gosh, where does one begin? Our topic is so large and so big. I thought what I might do is to focus on two particular topics and issues that we're going to be saddled with for quite some time unless we are able to exercise all our ingenuity to solve. The two topics I'm going to focus on debt and deleveraging, and then secondly on jobs. Let me start with the question of debt and deleveraging. One of the things that's been quite remarkable is that in the last decade or so, the world took on so much debt, and debt in most economies grew to such unprecedented levels that this is something we're going to have to deal with in a very fundamental way in the next few years. If you look at the most advanced economies, for example, just to put some parameters and facts around all of this, debt levels grew by about $10 trillion between about 2000 and 2008. That's an astounding number across advanced economies. And here I'm not talking about just government debt. I'm talking about household debt. I'm talking about debt in the financial in the financial institutions. I'm talking about debt in non-financial businesses, and it's an extraordinary amount of debt. And if you look at that, I think the most common views would most people perhaps might think that all of that debt is being concentrated in the financial sector. It hasn't. It's been pretty evenly spread across the four categories that I've just talked about. So where do we find ourselves on this question of the amount of debt and leverage in the economy? Well, it's a pretty, again, unprecedented place. You look at economies like the UK, for example. And one way to think about this question is to think about debt in terms of the amount of debt that an economy is carrying compared to the GDP. It's almost, in a proxy rough sense, a measure of how much debt you carry over the income and money that you actually earn. So at this particular point in time, the UK going into the crisis was carrying about 469% of debt over its GDP. That's a pretty astounding, as a percentage of its GDP. That's a pretty astounding number. You look at countries like Japan, equivalently they are at 459%. Spain at 342%. The U.S., which is depending on how you which point in time you pick, is either 7th or 8th, at about 290%. And it's a pretty astounding amount of debt to be carrying if you think about where that's actually spread. But here's the interesting point. If you compare the advanced economies in terms of the amount of debt that they're carrying with some of the BRIC economies that Dr. Dayalami was talking about, it's a pretty stark picture. So if you look at the BRICS, i.e. Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and you compare the numbers I just described with those countries, you find that they range between about 71% and about 150%. That's a pretty stark difference. So you start to see a big difference in terms of the amount of debt that different countries are actually carrying. As we all know, and I think many of us probably experienced, a big part of the debt that these economies now carry is actually household debt. And this grew in almost all the advanced countries to where it's at various levels above 100%. But what's interesting, and the U.S. in particular, is at about 130% if you look at household debt that households are carrying in the U.S. There are only two exceptions to this, by the way, which are quite interesting, and that's Germany and Japan. Over the last 10 years, the household debt actually went down, which is quite different from most of the other countries like the US and other countries. Well, the good news is that some of the deleveraging of some of this debt has actually begun to come down. In the financial sector, for example, debt levels are actually down to below 15-year averages, which is a good thing. The amount of deleveraging hasn't yet fully begun if you look at households or other businesses. In particular, in businesses, if you look at the commercial real estate companies and some of the companies that were owned to a large extent by private equity firms that were very highly leveraged, there's still a fair amount of deleveraging that still needs to happen. There. But I think there's some important lessons to learn from history on this question of carrying debt and deleveraging. And this is an important lesson for us as we look at what might happen over the next few years and how we might navigate our way through this. We've looked at 45 periods of deleveraging that have occurred over the last 100 years. Now, of those 45, about 32 of them happened post a recession, such as the one that we are hopefully coming out of. And when you look at those periods of deleveraging globally, there's sort of four patterns that actually emerge, and this might be instructive in terms of what we might actually experience. Roughly half of those periods of deleveraging essentially followed what you might describe as a belt-tightening period, where there's a fair amount of belt-tightening across pretty much all parts of the economy. Here you might think of what happened in the U.S. in 1933 to about 1935, what happened to South Korea and Malaysia in about 1998. You might describe all of that as kind of a belt-tightening approach to deleveraging. And that was roughly half of the periods we looked at. There were some examples of deleveraging where it was largely inflationary, which is usually the kind that you don't like. And there you might look at what happened, for example, to Spain and Italy in the mid-70s, what happened to Chile in the mid-80s. But there are some instances where that was the pattern that actually was followed. A third type of deleveraging was where we actually saw massive defaults whether it's by households or even sovereign debt, or whether it's financial institutions. And you might compare that to what happened, for example, in the US in 1929, in Argentina in 2002 up to about 2005, and what happened to Mexico in the 80s. And only a handful of instances have we seen this problem go away through countries growing their way out of it. It really is a handful, about 3 or 4. And in all the instances historically, those have been either associated with a war dividend, if you like. So you saw this in the US during the Second World War, or usually following an oil boom. You saw this in Nigeria in 2001, where it follows a dividend from something like oil. But here's the important point from looking at all of these periods. It's quite remarkable that all these periods of deleveraging took about 6 or 7 years. All of them is sort of the average period it took. So you might ask the question, so where are we in that 6 to 7 years? And in almost in all of them, there was an initial period of rapid GDP contraction, and then a rebound on the back of it. So this question of deleverage is going to be important. I'll come back to it at the end, because it has implications for how we think about stimulus in the short term and in the long term. Because on the one hand, while you want deleveraging to occur, whether it's within households or even government or even some of the other business sectors, that would probably imply that most of these categories are going to have to spend less. And if they spend less, that means that there's not enough demand in the economy to stimulate the economy. So it becomes a very complex problem. I'll come back to some thoughts, and maybe that's something we can discuss in the panel. Let me turn to my second area that I wanted to focus on, which is the question of jobs. Now, as everybody knows, this is a pretty awful picture, however you look at it. By some estimates, 34 million jobs have been lost globally, 7 or 8 million in the United States. The number of vulnerable workers who are now exposed, even though they may still be working, is up by 42 million people across the world. If you look at youth unemployment, it's particularly striking. In the US, it's now close to about 20%. In the EU, the average is about 22, 23%. Some countries like Spain, youth unemployment is 43%. I mean, these are pretty awful figures, and you can go on and on and on and on. And I would argue everybody in this room probably knows somebody who's been affected by this awful situation. But what I wanted to focus on the question of jobs are some what I might call myths that I wanted to clarify, because I think it's very important as we think about, so what do we do about the problem and challenges we've got around jobs? And I call them myths simply because I think in the typical rhetoric we all read about in the papers and out of elected officials and so forth, the way this is talked about, you would think that these are things that somebody must believe. So it's important to clarify a few points. First of all, I mean, if you read the typical press and papers, you might think there's a quick fix to this problem. Unfortunately, there isn't, actually, because if you look at it, we've experienced the deepest, fastest, and steepest decline in jobs and employment in a generation. And if you look at, again, historical periods, even at the period in the 80s, for example, when the U.S. economy was at its peak in terms of creating jobs, net new jobs each month, and even if you assume that we're going to exceed that, if we create jobs at the rate of 200,000 net new jobs a month, to get back to what we might call acceptable levels of unemployment, 4 or 5%, that's going to take about 6 or 7 years. And that's even creating net new jobs at a pretty phenomenal rate, which is far higher than the economy's ever done. So that's one way, when you get your mind around that, you quickly realize this is not a quick fix. It's also not a quick fix if you think about the fact that in addition to unemployment, we also now have the problem of what I might characterize as underemployment. So underemployment is the number of people who are, yes, employed, but are not working the hours that they would like to work. They don't have the full-time jobs that they would like to have. And so, if you look at the underemployment numbers, those numbers are in the low 20%. So we may be straddled here with a situation where for a period of time, if there is no quick fix, we may have some long-term structural unemployment and inequities to deal with in most advanced economies. So that's one point I wanted to highlight. Second, a myth you might take from listening to how these things are talked about is that it's all about getting those manufacturing jobs back. Well, if you look at, in between the period of the early 90s up until the last few years, the areas that have created the highest rates of net new jobs have not been manufacturing, but have actually been service sector jobs. Virtually all the net new jobs in the last 15 or so years have been created from service sector jobs. Second, manufacturing jobs have been in a long-term circular decline, and in fact now make up a very relatively small percentage of the U.S. economy. So to think that getting the manufacturing jobs will solve the massive unemployment issues we're talking about, I think just doesn't quite stand up to the facts. The third point I wanted just to address and perhaps provocatively challenge is often people talk about clean tech as the thing that's going to solve our jobs problem. Now, clean tech is obviously a very important topic, and for the kinds of reasons that Bob was talking about around sustainability and the environment. So by no means, I'm not saying that's not important. That's absolutely very important. But from a jobs point of view, it's largely insignificant. If you look at the amount of employment that's in clean tech today, it's about 0.6% of the employment in the U.S. economy. So even if you tripled that or quadrupled that, I mean, it's not big enough to make a massive difference in employment in the near term, unless you start to have sectors like clean tech start to impact other larger sectors, whether it's the larger energy sector or other large sectors who use the products out of clean tech, and there are incentives that drive massive, fast adoption of the products of clean tech, then maybe you start to affect employment. The fourth myth that I wanted to tackle is that there's so much focus on small and medium-sized businesses as the engine of net job creation. Small businesses are clearly very important, but large businesses are equally important, because if you look at, again, the structure of employment and where jobs have been created over the last 2 decades, they've been equal contributors to that. So the idea that it's just small business is only half the picture. Big businesses are important as well. And then the last point I wanted to tackle is the point often made that productivity kills jobs. Well, if you look at an economy-wide level, from the period since the post-war period from 1947 all the way up to the last couple of years, there's been a very strong, incredibly robust correlation between productivity growth and job growth at the national economy level. Now, that isn't always the case when you go sector by sector, because there are some sectors like education, for example, which is relatively low productivity, but is actually very high in terms of job creation. Healthcare is another sector that's like that. So the point is that different sectors, I think, make different kinds of contributions to the economy. But I think the long-run story around productivity, jobs, and economic growth is a very robust one. So let me stop at that point. Maybe we can get into some discussion and ideas around what are some of the solutions to these things when we get into our panel.
Thank you, James Manyika. And now Mr. Matthew Bishop, the New York Bureau Chief for The Economist.
Well, good morning. As Rich mentioned, I have a new book out called The Road from Ruin, How to Revive Capitalism and Put America Back on Top, and I'm in the middle of my book tour, so please forgive me if I largely base my remarks on the book. Be assured they are relevant to the topic, and actually very timely. We've just been chosen by the Huffington Post as their book of the month for March, which is great, and hopefully we can stimulate lots more debate outside this room about the subject. It's certainly a lot more timely than my previous book, Philanthrocapitalism, also on sale outside this room, as I shamelessly pitched to you, which came out a week after Lehman Brothers went bust and made the case for philanthropy. So fortunately, as Jane Wales will attest with her other hat on, philanthropy remains alive and well and more influential and important than ever. But the timing of this book feels a lot better to me. Writing in the Huffington Post this week, Arianna Huffington said, having a business editor of The Economist start things off with a frank admission of the fundamental flaws in the way we do capitalism is one of the main reasons I picked The Road from Ruin as this month's HuffPost Book Club selection. And that's very much what the book is about. For many years, I've written at The Economist, as have so many of my colleagues, about the bubbles that we saw around us in the financial markets, about the massive imbalances in the global economy, about the failure of the various institutions that are in charge of the world economy, and of our fears about the risks that were being taken by banks and other financial institutions, and questions about their internal risk management systems and so forth. And yet, I candidly will say to you that when Lehman Brothers went bust in September 2008 and the financial system had to be bailed out, and in fact the global economy had to be bailed out by governments, I was really taken aback by how fragile our system and the capitalism at the heart of it proved to be. And the reason I and my co-author decided to write the book was to try and make sense of that, of what had happened and what we need to do to actually improve the system and have a more robust capitalism and a more robust global economy going forward. And I have to say to you that I and my co-author are both shocked by the extent to which there is a desire in Washington, in other capitals of the world, and in our business leaders to pretend this is just another economic cycle, that we're starting to pull our way out of it, that it can be in some way back to business as usual, and how little fundamental reform has been done so far that would give me any confidence to feel that we're not going to go through the same disastrous cycle that we went through 2 years ago, again in maybe a few years' time. And I do think we need fundamental reforms. We need some real changes in how all of us actually, I think, approach these economic challenges that we deal with each day. The book is a book of two halves. The first half, we wanted to understand this financial crisis in the context of history. And so we've looked back at financial bubbles, crashes, recessions, depressions, and how they happened and how they were handled, all the way back to tulip mania in Holland in the 17th century, but looking at the Great Depression here and the lost decade in Japan in the 1990s, which I still worry is increasingly the most likely scenario for the American economy unless some really big reforms are done. Easily we could go through 5 or 10 years of jobless and minimal growth if someone doesn't grasp the nettle. The second half is looking at 4 big ideas we think are needed for reform. This includes a complete overhaul of the economic ideas that our policymakers use to actually throw ideas like efficient market hypothesis and great moderation and the idea that you can abolish boom and bust forever out of the policy tools and start using models of the economy that actually reflect the reality of how humans behave individually and in crowds, and how also how institutions work. I mean, it shocks me that the Fed didn't have a meaningful model of how its interest rate decisions transmit through the banking system to the credit creation process, so they didn't get the reaction that they expected when they did pump all that money into the banks after 2008 in terms of lending to ordinary businesses. We also need to get away from this ghastly culture of short-termism in capitalism that was, I guess, best summed up by the culture on Wall Street known as IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. The idea that you'd take your bonus for simply doing the deal and make sure you'd move to another firm before they realised what a terrible deal it was. But fundamentally, our whole system is incredibly short-termist, and I hope that we can start shifting the focus on how do we make our institutions work in a way that is focused on the sustainability of society and the sustainability of the profits that are earned in the short run over the long term, and that we're actually creating real, lasting wealth rather than the sort of illusory wealth that the growth of the financial sector proved to be. I also believe that we need to take very seriously the notion of financial literacy, not just as it's often talked about for poor people and children, but for politicians, board members, and the media. And in fact, all of us. I think we've all done a really lousy job in having an informed debate about economics, and I think the crisis that we're seeing in Washington at the moment about the inability to reform how the economy works and to make the case for some of the international policies that are in America's and the world's interest that the Undersecretary talked about this morning, all comes back to a fundamental unwillingness to be serious in our thinking about economics and to teach it and make it the heart of our education system. And so we need to really take that seriously. But the other big idea is the one that I really want to focus on, which is most relevant to the topic this morning, which is that we need a Bretton Woods 2.0, to use the popular phrase, that this is a global economy, this is a global crisis that we're going through. You only need to look at what's happening in Greece to understand that, or in Britain, as was just mentioned. I mean, Britain is in a terrible mess. This is not just about the American subprime mortgage situation. And our global economy is still operating on rules and with institutions largely the product of Bretton Woods after the Second World War and that one period in human history where the world economic powers actually got together and did something really constructive about building a modern global economic architecture. And we need to revisit that. We need to actually do that again so that we have appropriate institutions for the economy we have now and the economy that we would like to build in the future, which I think is an economy in which China and India and others are fully integrated into the world economy for exactly the reasons that Bob was talking about earlier, that it's in all our interests to be well connected in that way because it locks people into a more progressive political system. So there are a number of ideas that we float in the book. I mean, certainly the IMF needs to be beefed up and transformed. That the IMF's failure in the Asian crisis of the late 90s, I think, contributed to the loss of confidence that many developing economies had, that led them to build up very large foreign reserves and then lend them back at very low rates to countries like America, which seemed incapable of resisting the chance to spend cheap credit. We need, I believe, to really refocus on how do we make aid work properly. There's been a lot of debate about the ineffectiveness of aid, that aid is dead, but I think there are ways in which aid can be smart and effective, and the case needs to be made for that, and the World Bank needs to be re-energized in that way. There are changes going on, but it needs to go a lot further. The UN obviously needs to be made to work in a much more effective way. We make the case in the book for moving away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency to a new global reserve currency because we believe the dollar regime that's dominated the world for the last half century has now become a burden not just to the rest of the world but also to America, and we really need to grasp that nettle and create a structure that's actually capable of dealing with the emergence of economies like China and India and without causing major imbalances of the sort we've seen. And then we have the problem of climate change as well. All these issues are locked up and interrelated with each other, and I think need to be addressed in a sort of Big Bang way, all at once. People have asked me, why have I got the subtitle of the book, How to Revive Capitalism and Put America Back on Top? Why, as a Brit, do I want America to be back on top? Good question.
That's all the time we have. Thanks very much.
Exactly. And obviously, shameless marketing to viewers of Fox News is part of the strategy there, and we'll have a different subtitle outside America. But part of the reason is that America is still the world's leading economy, and if it doesn't get its act together, the rest of the world is going to suffer. But the other is that we make the case in the book for America really taking the lead, that America is the only economy that has the ability, and the only superpower that has the ability to bring everyone else to the table and offer a meaningful deal of the sort that would bring about the new global architecture that we think is needed. And that if America doesn't take the lead, this notion of leadership being enlightened leadership that brings others to the table, then it's not going to happen. And I know this is very difficult. I think it was mentioned earlier that selling the UN to the American people after the Second World War was pretty tough. But one of the things I was struck by in researching this book was that Marshall Aid, which I think is one of the great previous examples of an enlightened international leadership by America, that Truman basically went out of his way to keep Marshall Aid secret from the American people by keeping it out of the media because he felt he couldn't sell it to them. So this is a huge challenge, and I understand the difficulties that politicians face. But this is a unique moment. I think if we don't get leadership of the kind that we're arguing for, then there are real dangers for America and for the world. In the aftermath of that crash of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, we saw, I think, what is the high point of coordinated global action on economic matters, where governments around the world came together to bail out the financial system, keep it alive, and stimulate the world economy. And as a result, we have dodged the bullet. We've avoided a really deep recession, which I think would have happened had they not acted in that way. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the G20 would emerge as a big step forward from the G8 that actually brought some of the developing economies to the table and gave them real influence, and that might actually produce a kind of really constructive agenda for global reform. My fear is that already the momentum has gone out of that process, and that what we saw in Copenhagen in December is more likely to be the way ahead for the world than what we saw in the weeks after September 2008, unless America really changes course and comes to the table with things that really make a deal attractive to countries like China, not capitulating to China, but giving them access and power in return for more responsible behaviour from them, as has been achieved in one respect with the WTO. In Europe, we've talked a lot over the years about how the only way that Europe had to keep on reforming, otherwise the whole process of European integration would collapse. And I guess we're going to find out if that's true in the next few months. But I think the metaphor that was used a lot was if you're on a bicycle, you have to keep pedalling, otherwise you fall off. I think that is also true now of the globalization of the world economy and the kind of prosperous world order that we've had over the last 50 years, that if we don't, I think we're pedaling extremely slowly at the moment and beginning to wobble. And unless someone, and it has to be America, starts pedaling pretty aggressively, there is a danger that we really go into reverse, and that the prosperity of the world suffers and the prosperity of America suffers. So I don't want to end on that negative note, because the book is an optimistic book, and I'm an optimist, and the Economist is an optimistic magazine. We do believe that these problems can be fixed, but they can only be fixed with leadership. And my challenge to you as people who care about these issues and who have influence is that you will go out and urge your political leaders to take an even more positive role in trying to build that new world order than they're doing at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks to all of the panelists. Wonderful scope in those comments. We've got a lot of wonderful questions here. I'll do my best to do them justice. There are many categories of questions. I loved the closing remarks, in particular about leadership. Obviously, rules of the game and policy matters a lot. From my seat, it's also the private sector and the leaders that we have that are helping us bend many of those paths. Very much what business schools and other professional schools at all of our universities are spending their time thinking about and addressing. Let me start with a set of questions that relate to Mansour's initial comments and the World Bank. So With the World Bank, could we have a few, Mansour, a few specific examples of projects that the World Bank has engaged in that have been particularly successful, examples of poverty alleviation in countries where it has been a particularly difficult challenge, and perhaps effects its stimulus and stabilization in specific countries in response to the crisis? In a set of questions around those, but specific examples.
Sure, well, I mean, we are obviously a development agency, and with 60 years of experience of working on development, and poverty has always been the mandate of the bank to reduce poverty, alleviate poverty. I think the number one lessons we have learned is that poverty could be reduced through economic growth, fundamentally. That's the number one factor. You can make intervention, various projects through providing to social sectors, health, education, nutrition, that we have a large number of projects virtually in most of these countries, but it's really fundamentally trying to help countries to reform the macroeconomic situation, to open up to the international economy in a cautious and gradual manner to stimulate growth. I think that is really number one lesson. Then there has obviously been the cases that the countries have gone through major catastrophic changes, what we call the most distressed countries. That we have had several program emergency support, where they talk about earthquake in Haiti, or now actually providing program even in Chile. There's always, bank has been in the forefront of providing emergency programs, but at the same time, building on those emergency programs for the reconstruction. There's a good reason that the bank is called International Bank for Reconstruction, because it is already been going on for 60 years. I can tell you, for instance, programs that we have worked in India for many years. We have several programs on education, on health, on nutrition. Program even in China, for instance. China, despite the fact that it has today $2.4 trillion of reserves, keep a very active relationship with the bank because they think they need the bank in areas that they can use the knowledge and expertise. In the infrastructure, the bank was very active in building China. Nowadays, in the environmental issues, the bank has been helping China quite a lot. I think in Latin America, for instance, I can give examples again in the same sectors, but it's really the combination of trying to use the knowledge across countries. When you work with 140 countries and you see development going through one country or another, in my own personal experience, I've been in the development field for almost 30 years. I saw, for instance, how India in the 1991 went through a major financial crisis, that they did not have reserve to cover 2 weeks of imports. I was at that time assigned to put together a loan for India very quickly. But today I see India, which reserves are close to $300 billion. Economy has been growing close to 6, 7, 8, 9%. For many years, India's growth rate was so-called the Hindu rate of growth, 3%. It was through this economic reform, through this macroeconomic stabilization and opening up to the world international system that they could lift the growth to 8 to 9%, and was through this rate of growth that they could reduce poverty. I have been a little bit maybe more optimistic in this panel. It's partly because when I was seeing these countries, that they really want to see basically the wisdom of opening up to the international system, despite all of the challenges of the globalization. Honestly, that is the only way forward. We cannot afford, whether you're talking about developing countries or developed countries, to go back to protectionism or to go back to retreat to what we went through in the 1930s.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Another domain of questions has to do, I'm going to switch the focus back more toward the U.S. and think about the jobs picture in the U.S. James addressed that head on, and Matthew's comments were quite related as well. So here's one question. What specific things can U.S. policymakers do, or should they do, to stimulate more employment in the U.S.? And related questions came up with refreshing perspectives like, could one imagine a New Deal type of program that emphasizes green jobs? This you touched on in your myths. Another, might we begin to think of the nonprofit sector as an area where there's tremendous room for both job creation and addressing some deep social problems? Any comments from you first, James?
Well, I think on the question of what can policymakers do, I think there's a big overarching question that sits on all of that, which is there isn't enough discussion going on at the moment about how to stimulate demand growth. Because what we've got companies that are able to produce goods at phenomenal rates of productivity. The issue is that there isn't enough demand out there to soak it up. And I think one of the challenges is that historically the U.S. has relied largely on consumer spending to fuel its growth. I mean, up in the last 2 decades, 71% of the growth driving the U.S. economy was actually consumers and household spending. But I think we now need to look at other contributors to that in the economy to drive growth. One that I would look at is clearly the business sector. One of the good things is that businesses now generally have pretty decent balance sheets. So to the extent that the government is now putting together policies that stimulate business spending and business hiring, I think that'll make a big difference. The other part of it is, I'm quite pleased to see some of the policies around exports, but the other big arena is around what the government itself can do. I mean, one of the things that's quite striking when you match up the jobs question with the competitiveness of the U.S. itself in an increasingly highly competitive global economy where countries, as Dr. Delamo was describing, now are also competitive, is how does the U.S. rebuild its infrastructure? So there's a whole lot of infrastructure development that would be both good for jobs but also for reestablishing the global leadership of the United States, whether it's broadband infrastructure or transportation infrastructure. But the whole area of initiatives around infrastructure, I think, could make a big difference.
Thank you, James. Matthew, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I mean, the challenge, and I agree with much of what James has said, the challenge is for the government to do two opposite things at the same time. It needs to both stimulate the economy more, which means a bigger deficit, whilst at the same time providing a credible plan for reducing the deficit over the longer term. I think when Keynes was writing in the 30s, he advocated the kind of stimulus that could be as crude as putting money in bottles, burying it in the ground and letting people dig it up. That may have worked in a time when you basically didn't have government deficits, but I think today would probably be the final proof that Congress had lost all its marbles. And so you actually do need to have a strategy that persuades people that the long-term fiscal problems that America has built up are going to be addressed. And I don't hear anything on that front at the moment. I mean, I think there is a very powerful case that could be made for modernizing American infrastructure and doing that in a very sensible way. But the amount of pork barrel politics that you hear about at the moment, even if infrastructure is talked about, the chances that it would go to the right things, who's going to feel confident about that? The other lesson, though, of history is clearly that in both the 1930s in America and in Japan in the 1990s, the government stimulated eventually, the economy started to grow, and they stopped stimulating too early, and the economy went back into recession in both cases. So I think that does say that from a purely managing the next year or two, I would expect, and I think the government should be, the government here and around the world should be stimulating longer than rather than shorter. But I really want to, I think the politics of the second phase of reversing that policy are the really tricky questions where I really want to see something that makes me convinced that it's going to be solved, articulated. And I think only then do businesses start to hire people again, do people start to feel confident about spending money again. And I think at the moment that's the lack of any vision on that front makes me think this will be a very long and slow process of getting out of this mess.
Thank you for that comment. There were a number of questions that came in that were at the level of some of the clash of philosophy level perspective, i.e. Keynesian economic theory and countercyclical stimulation versus more of a supply side approach, and a wonderful nuance in thinking about how we look at the other side of traditional Keynesian stimulus and make sure that it is sustainable and consistent with the path that we're trying to achieve. Here's a wonderfully personal question that I quite like. The person writes, particularly James and Matthew, some of the perspective that we got was challenging perspective. Where's the silver lining? And specifically, what should the average person, individual, do to affect positive change in this context? Any thoughts on that? Please, James.
Well, actually, three thoughts. I think one is one that I think everybody touched upon, which is, we all have a responsibility to push for sensible policy making, which is relatively politics free. I think that's something we all should do to the extent that we can, absolutely. But I think there are two other things. One of the things that has historically always made a difference are individuals who are focused on trying to innovate and trying to change things and trying to come up with different ways of either doing work, different ways of improving themselves, different ways of changing businesses. The power of individual innovation, I think, is quite remarkable, especially in this country and especially in the Bay Area. So I think I wouldn't underestimate the power of that, because many small ideas have been shown to become very large ideas, become very large businesses and very large transformational ideas. So the power of individual innovation, I think, is a very important one. The last one that I would add is just around education. I mean, if you look at the question of education, it's become so important on so many dimensions. First of all, even when these jobs come back, and hopefully they will in all the sectors we've talked about, they're probably going to look different than they have looked in the past 20 years. So it's not about just reclaiming the same jobs and getting them back again. So to the extent that individuals can really think about how do they empower themselves and prepare themselves for the form in which these jobs, when they come back, will look like. I think that's a very important point as well.
Thank you, James. Manyika. Matthew?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm planning to write about next week for the Huffington Post is a 10-point plan for people to do things practically themselves. And obviously, any individual is not going to be able to turn this around on their own, but I think there are lots of different things that can make a small difference and start pushing the system in the right direction. One of them has been this campaign of Move Your Money, which the Huffington Post actually started, which has said if you don't like too big to fail institutions, take your money out and put them in your local community, put your money in the local community banks, which I think has moved quite a significant amount of money and is a good start. I believe that financial literacy, as I said, is absolutely crucial to the future sustainability of the economy, and there's all sorts of ways that any of us that do feel we're relatively competent in our finances, can start to share our knowledge. There's a campaign called 5mk.org, which is headed by Andrew Young and Quincy Jones, which is about trying to get people to spend 12 hours, half a day a year, going into schools and teaching the basics of finance, and maybe giving people an internship who wouldn't normally experience what it's like to be inside an office, and just preparing people for a better understanding of finance. I also, again, it's only going to be symbolic in some ways, but it's the right symbolism. I like the fact that MBA students are now starting to take this MBA oath, where they actually vow to try and manage companies when they go out to work in a way that's in the interest of society. I mean, that seems to me at least to be saying the right thing and creating some pressure on them to put that into practice when they get out there. And so maybe this whole notion of actually encouraging people to take oaths may just send the right leadership signal to other people.
Wonderfully grounded ideas and suggestions. Thank you. So many big topics. If I may come back to a topic that is really relevant, I think, for all three of you, but that notion that came up in the first session of sustainability, unsustainability, pathways that on so many fronts, whether we're thinking about healthcare or we're thinking about carbon, or we're thinking about wealth distribution, right, that feel like they're, at least on a linear extrapolation, feel unsustainable. So I guess I'd like a quick comment. Mansoor, why don't we start with you? How is the bank thinking about that? How are you thinking about some of those issues?
Well, I think we look at sustainability in the medium-term to long-term perspective. I mean, when we look at the growth rates, we look at how can you, for instance, countries like India, China, which are large countries, over 1 billion of population, if they want to grow at the rate of 7 or 8%, what are going to be the pressure that they're going to put on the energy supply, on the commodity markets, on the environment? And these are the issues that have to be thought through, not when it is too late. We have to think about today that, again, look at it. If China grows at 9% growth, I mean, one slide, which actually I had, I didn't show you that. From 1961 to 2010, China's economy grew by 60 times larger. There was about $100 billion, became close to $60 trillion. 60 times larger. I mean, this is because of the 8% growth rate over 60 years. Now, if you project that into the future, this is inevitably going to have some impact on the ecology, on the energy supply, and on the environment. These are the type of issues that you have to bring in at one level. Then the other kind of sustainability that we are talking about, what we call inclusive sustainability. That the population at large, here whether you're talking about the United States economy, Europe, and developing countries, they have to feel part of the growth that benefited them, that they're committed to that economy. If you have part of the society being kind of excluded, inevitably would have some political reaction, and there's going to be much more protectionism. That's the second aspect of sustainability. The third one is really, I think, after this crisis, one lesson which we learned is that, again and again, you cannot grow based on asset bubbles. From 2002 to 2007, the whole world economy was growing because the huge amount of liquidity was going around the markets, interest rate extremely low. That created a huge amount of asset increase in the prices. The people felt rich. But in reality, it was not reaching wealth, because we saw when the stock market crashed, almost $14 trillion of wealth, or the globally $30 trillion of wealth was wiped out. And that obviously had impact on consumption. Then to the extent that we can really have an economy, that there would be less of this type of asset bubbles, asset appreciation that could induce consumption in the wrong way, to the extent to which that we can look at the long-term environmental aspects of the growth and think about them today, not 10 years later. And to the extent to which we can think about inclusive growth, that everybody shares the benefit today. I think that's how you can make sustainable a reality rather than just a talk.
Thank you, Mansoor. James, please. Yeah.
I'll just make one comment on sustainability. I think one of the things that I think is remarkably positive that's occurred in the last decade or so is the fact that we now all are talking about climate change and the question of climate change. Clearly, there have been people who have been talking about this for several decades, but it's now part of our public discourse and dialogue. So now you find companies, governments, citizens, everybody now is talking about it. But I think that discussion needs to extend to other aspects of sustainability. There's a whole set of resources that haven't entered that same dialogue, whether it's water or other natural resources. There are clearly activists working on those things, but that's got to become part of our public discourse and dialogue. So I think we need to broaden the question of the issues about our world and our environment that are truly part of our public discourse.
Thank you very much. Please, Matthew.
2 points. One, I think that on the issue of environmental sustainability and also the social sustainability of doing business in rapidly developing economies, the main reason companies haven't been doing enough has been the short-term pressures that they've succumbed to. That there's a massive win-win for most companies that are able to think long-term in addressing both those problems in a responsible way. And I'm encouraged, for example, by Walmart and its embrace of the green sustainability agenda, which they've got a partnership now with Environmental Defence, which I think is one of the very, very robust, high-integrity NGO, which is working with it to figure out how to make its supply chain much more environmentally sustainable. And Walmart being as powerful as it is, that's having huge implications for all the other firms that use its manufacturers and its supply chain, and I think having a very, very positive effect in that one area. You could debate other aspects of Walmart's corporate culture from a different perspective, but I think on the sustainability of their environmental side, very, very positive. Equally unlikely candidate to mention is KKR, the private equity firm famous as barbarians at the gate in the 1980s. They also have a partnership with Environmental Defence to look at every firm in their portfolio to try and come up with a more environmentally sustainable strategy. So I think there's, and again, private equity, one of the defining features of that, at least in theory, is that they are protected from the short-term pressures of the stock market and can pursue longer-term strategies. They don't always do that, but that at least is the idea. The other thing I'd want to point out is that on climate change, it ultimately comes down to America and China doing a deal on getting carbon emissions down. That America and China are the world's biggest emitters of carbon, and I think China has a point that America has enjoyed being able to become rapidly a very well-developed country without worrying about the price of carbon, and it therefore seems unfair to say to China, you must develop more slowly because we're going to charge you for carbon. So I think America is going to have to give some compensation to China to persuade China to sign up to a sustainable carbon regime that actually will make us all better off in the long run. But I think that's the political challenge.
Thank you, Matthew Bishop. A number of questions on China, if I may go to that topic. China, India, the BRICS, there are many elements of this. I'll just focus it on China, many of the questions focused there. As we extrapolate, we've all read an awful lot about this, but this profound shift in relative economic weight and power within our own lifetimes and certainly within our children's lifetimes. Also, not just weight and role, but also as China moves up the innovation ladder and starts moving into, somebody mentioned capital exports, and right, the shift there, I think that was you, James. Could we think a little bit out 20, 30, 40 years and how profoundly realigned that could look? And can you give people comfort, or should we stir people up even more? How do we think about this?
Well, can I briefly come in on that? I mean, I think that we have a huge choice now, and it could go in very different ways. What I think is clear is that population, to some extent, is going to be destiny, and China and India have significantly larger populations than America, and barring some radical shift in their policies, they are going to become much more significant economies by the middle of this century. And therefore, the choice that we face is, are we going to manage that process, I say manage it from our perspective, so that that becomes a positive win-win, or are we going to resist, try to bury our heads in the sand and pretend it's not going to happen, much as Britain, my home country, did when it ceased to become the economic hegemon because some former colony was doing better across the Atlantic. Britain couldn't have played a worse game, and I think one of the challenges for America is to play a more enlightened role in managing its shift to relative power. One of the areas, if we just look now at Africa, this is the first battleground between where we see an alternative vision of how it could work out happening, where you're seeing China come in and buy up a lot of resources, do deals with very dodgy regimes, flood the country with Chinese workers, the road signs in Mandarin in some countries in Africa upset the locals. There's a real challenge there for us to offer a better alternative and to actually encourage China to behave differently.
Thank you. James, please.
So one of the things you asked us, Richard, the question asked, what this might look like 20, 30, 50 years from now. One of the things that's quite striking about that question is if you if you play out the current trends, where are things likely to end up? So, and that always leads me to worry that often the U.S. is thinking with the rear-view mirror mindset. Let me explain what I mean. If you look at today, the U.S. economy is by far the most attractive economy on every dimension still, right? Whether you look at the macroeconomic indicators, even though I complained about infrastructure, yes, the infrastructure is still there. You look at the demographic, all spending, all of those things are still great. But the thing that's changed the most is that if you look at just how much better other countries are becoming on those same dimensions, especially, again, countries like China and India, and especially on questions of talent and education and innovation, the number of patents, the number of graduate engineers that are coming out, those are rapidly coming up. So if you literally just play out those trends, it's going to be a pretty interesting, kind of almost even-handed, interesting global situation 50 years from now. I think the challenge and the opportunity for the U.S. is to almost reestablish its leadership with the future in mind, not so much the rear-view mirror view of itself. And I don't think that's quite happened as quickly as it should, nor is policymaking thinking with the, prospectively as opposed to, retrospectively.
Super, thank you. And then World Bank perspective, anything you'd like to add to this?
Well, I think, the question is if you take a kind of linear projection of growth rate to China, 8 to 9%, most industrial countries 2.5% to 3% maximum. That's a substantial growth differential. And given the size of the economy, this is going to be a totally different world. We call it the multipolar world. But I think part is the question, as Matthew quite mentioned, how are we going to manage this process? The way that has been managed so far, after all, China has been growing at 8 to 9% for 20 years, is that the Chinese interests have been accommodated within the system, and they have realized that the interest was within the system and keep the system going, which means to some extent the liberal open trading and financial system. Maybe at some point in the line, God knows, maybe by 2025, the Chinese realize that from now on, their interest is to change the shape, the whole system quite completely. And that's the big risk. Nobody can anticipate that. That if they realize that, but the way they have been doing that, by going to various investing in many African countries, in Latin America, in the oil sector, in the mining sector, rather than using markets to access the oil resources, they go directly invest in Nigeria, in many countries in the Middle East, buy the oil fields, or invest in the governments. And this has been the strategy they have taken so far. But somewhere in the line, if they realize that they feel powerful enough, both in terms of economic size, in terms of the control that they may have on various natural resources in the world, that they could come up with their own strategy of how the world should be managed, should be ordered. And that's the big risk that we don't know, because after all, I think one point which seems that all of us agree is that the United States leadership from 1945-44 till today has given us an open liberal system. And we all want that to continue. And I think that's why everybody comes back to the role of the United States, both in terms of leadership and in terms of vision. The vision part is to see the interest of these countries in a collective way. And then we want to realize that inevitably the relative size of the U.S. economy is going to decline. It doesn't mean the U.S. cannot be in the front seat, but the relative size is going to decline because just simple mathematics. Already, if you go back to the past 20 years, U.S. economy was about 30% of the world economy. Now it's 25%. Projected to the next 10, 15 years could be 20%, 15%. But recognition of that, and again, planning ahead, thinking globally rather than incrementally. So far, the strategy has been incremental. China is becoming important, have a bilateral relationship. India comes, have another bilateral relationship. I was very delighted to hear that the Secretary mentioned that the time has come to think strategically and collectively rather than bilaterally.
Thank you, Mansour. So many questions. Here's one that I'll toss it to you, Mansour, and others if they want to speak up, please do. The reduced role or changing role of women in developing countries. Cause for concern, lots of optimism, microcredit. How do we think about the role of women in our world economy?
I think there's been both positive and negative. I mean, we have seen many countries that women employment in particular export sector have increased quite a lot. If you look at Kenya, Uganda, in their, let's say, cut flower industry, it's been very much industry run by women. Garment industry in many countries, including Cambodia, women had 70%. But during the crisis, they were the ones severely affected. And I think this is again where you have a concentration but not well balanced. That's one. Secondly, as I mentioned, there is still a very bias against women or girls in terms of education, in terms of nutrition. And believe me, we have seen that country after country. When they have a crisis, when the economy goes kind of downward, when the government budget becomes tight, when the government reduces expenditure on the core, let's say, education, and when people realize that the budget is very tight, it's the women or the girls who have become victimized. And this has long-term consequences. And we are becoming very conscious of that. In fact, in many of the programs we put together, we try to provide safeguard as much as possible. In terms of microfinance, obviously Bangladesh provided this extreme remarkable example that women entrepreneurship, and women could be a good creditor in terms of borrowing and lending to each other, in terms of community services. But we are far away. I think there has been some progress, but by no standard, we can say still many of the growths are not biased against the gender. And that's why the gender has been a very important part of the development debate and the development discourse that we have been talking about.
Thank you very much, Mansour. Why don't we were getting to the end of the session. I think what I'd like to ask is each of the panelists one question. They touched on this topic, all of them, but I thought let's have them make a stand. If you could change one thing, presumably one policy, but I'll let you answer it more broadly, that would ensure or come closest to ensuring that we will not go through a crisis like we just went through or are still going through, what's the one thing you'd say, bang, I would take a stand on that? Please. How about you, Matthew, first?
A simple question. I don't know what. I guess it took me to write a whole book to actually answer that question. To boil it down to one thing, I just think that we need our leaders to actually take seriously the idea that fundamental reform is needed and to do something about it. At the moment, what I'm most worried about is the denial, this sense of economies have cycles, this was just another downturn, we can get back to business as usual. If we can just get away from that and actually grasp the nettle that this is I believe this is a significant moment for this generation as the fall of the wall in Europe was for previous generation, and the Vietnam War to a generation before that, and the Great Depression to a generation before that, and the Second World War. This is a big moment, and none of what I hear from our leaders makes me feel that they've grasped that nettle. Nice.
Awareness that fundamental reform is needed. James, please.
Well, Matthew, you actually took the one that I was going to bring up, so I have to come up with a different one.
You can have the one I didn't say.
Well, this one perhaps is quite specific. I actually think we need a whole set of reforms around the incentives that are in our tax system that make it easy to pile up debt. You see it whether in terms of household debt, in terms of mortgages or houses. There's just a system that preferences and makes it easy for people to pile up debt. I think that's got to change.
Nice insight. Mansour, please.
Well, I would say definitely one area, better regulation of financial system, whether you're talking banking system, shadow banks, derivative markets. We honestly cannot afford to have another crisis being created by Wall Street or a few bankers. I mean, that is really one issue. Because this crisis costs everybody. I mean, as I said, it's very incredible that you see a crisis in the subprime market. When you look at the size of the subprime market in the United States, very small. I mean, it's about 1 billion in was. The whole U.S. mortgage market was 10 billion. But the way it affected markets after market, country after country, that shows that the markets are so interconnected that we cannot afford not to have a strong regulatory system in place. That's number one. Secondly, I think James mentioned the question of incentives, and we have a number of young audience here, people here. It really comes back to the question of, as an individual, we are all both economic agent and we are political agent. Obviously, in an economic agent, we make decisions, we invest, we work, we purchase things. As a political agent, it's where we have for the moment not to think about our own economic incentive or interest, but try to look beyond that. That means basically look at the next couple of years, say that as the time which is now this critical time, and thinking all of those changes, what kind of political system would best afford? And this political system ultimately depends on each individual decision in terms of politics that they can put together.
Thank you, Mansour. Thanks to all of the panelists. If you would join me in thanking them. If I could attempt and perfectly summarize some of these last thoughts, I love the acronym. I will change it slightly. IBH, YBH, I'll be here, you'll be here. A sense of stewardship that emerged from this conversation was marvelous. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, I would like to thank Mansour Dailami, James Manyika, and Matthew Bishop once again for their enlightening remarks. I also like to thank again Undersecretary Hormats for his encompassing remarks. I want to thank all of you for your questions. I read a lot of these and learned a lot, and I'm sorry I couldn't have asked all of them. There are really some very clever ideas in many, many of the questions. If you're interested in reading more on any of these topics, please visit our book table. There you will find, for example, Matthew Bishop's new book, The Road from Ruin, and also his earlier book, Ill-Timed, Philanthrocapitalism, and as well as many other books from our conference speakers.